well. It does not place a limit on loans by candidates to themselves. So candidates can still make their own contributions to themselves and their candidate committees. This is just from external parties and individuals making contributions to the candidate. So under the bill, the limits you can see for governor, lieutenant governor increase from 2 to 4,000. For members of the House and local offices, it's from 500 to 1,000. And for members of the state Senate or State Board of Education, it's from 1,000 to 2,000. There are also some limits that are removed under the bill. There are the language on page 2 on contribution limits made to party committees is being stricken. You see that in lines 5 through 16. And contribution limits on candidates of the same political party running in a primary election. Those limits starting in line 23 of page 2 are also being stricken from the statute. And then you see some new language on pages 2 and 3. The House Committee on Elections added this language, and so the new language there at the bottom of page 2 makes only actual cash payments, money transfers by party committees to candidates subject to the contribution limits. So in-kind contributions that are made by party committees to candidates are not included. The value of that in-kind contribution is not included in the contribution limit under the statute. So there would be no limit on those in-kind contributions. And then the other change you see at the top of page 3 would allow for the receipt of contributions for both primary and general election activities prior to the primary election. So you could accept general election contributions before the primary election. You just must have an acceptable accounting method to isolate those contributions so that they are only expended for the general election, so you don't entangle the two with respect to the contribution limits with respect to those. And so the acceptable accounting methods are laid out there in the bill on page 3. The bill was also amended by the House Elections Committee to go into effect on Kansas Register rather than July 1, so it would be effective on an earlier date if passed. The final action vote in the House on this bill was 77 to 46, and with that, I'd be happy to stand for any questions.
Committee questions for Jason. Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. So you talked about the accounting method, and it's the recorded amount of cash on hands was at all times equal. Where are these records kept?
These are the, I believe, basically the accounting records by the treasurer of the committee that's accepting the contributions.
And that's what I would have thought, but I do know that those books aren't necessarily brought up to date weekly or even monthly. So I'm not sure how that could ever be followed, but thank you.
Committee, further questions for Jason. Senator Gossage.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Jason, I'm trying to figure out how is this different than the bill we just heard recently on election contributions?
I believe the Senate bill did not adjust who the contribution limits applied to on page 1. You see on this bill, lines 9 through 11 on page 1, I don't believe that language was stricken under Senate Bill 177, and so there's some adjustment there in terms of who the contribution limits applied to. 177 also didn't include, as written, didn't include these new provisions on pages 2 and 3 regarding the in-kind contributions and the acceptance of general election contributions prior to a primary election. Those provisions were not in 177 as it was written and introduced. 177 also had that wrinkle of local candidates based on jurisdiction size. So your limit, if your jurisdiction was 50,000 and above, you had a higher contribution limit than if your jurisdiction was under 50,000 in population.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Further questions. Senator Dietrich.
Vice Chair. So, and maybe this is a research question, not a revisor question, but why is it important that we're allowed to accept campaign contributions during a primary election for the general? Because if you don't win the primary, you don't have a general. I just think that's an odd addition.
I believe, and the conferee coming up after me can probably confirm this, but I believe this is language lifted out of current federal campaign regulations that allow for acceptance of general election contributions prior to the primary. And if you don't win the primary, those are contributions sitting in your account and would be dealt with as any contributions left in your account after you lose the election. They either stay there for another campaign, or you have to disperse them according to law.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Vice.
Senator Aletha Falscadell.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. So Jason, so I get the part of increasing the contributions. However, eliminating such, we want to eliminate such limits on contributions to the party committee. So now if current law, I can make a contribution to my party. Mm-hmm. And you're saying, so verify, do we want to increase it, eliminate it? What do we want to do?
So
part?
What the bill is doing is it's removing the limits on making contributions to a party committee. So you can contribute an unlimited amount of money to a party committee, but it is also on page 1 striking the party committee from their exemption on the contribution limits to the candidate. So the party committee, while they can receive money unlimited, they are now going to be subject to these limits in terms of how much they can give to a particular candidate. That's the policy change there.
Further questions for Jason? Senator Francisco.
And following up on that question from Senator Falscadell, so they would be limited in terms of cash, but not in terms of in-kind contributions.
That's correct.
Further questions? Seeing none, thank you very much, Jason. We have one proponent in person, Josh Nye. Welcome to committee.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. Yeah, if you recognize this theme, it's because Senate Bill 177 last week was basically the same thing. This is just what the House did. And so I think I telegraphed in that testimony last week via WebEx some of the what you can do and what the issues are. Ultimately, there are a couple things different in the House bill that I want to speak to first before we get to the same type of issues we talked about last week regarding party caps that are different that I don't think I addressed last week. And one of those is that this idea of accepting the primary and general election checks at the same time. This is pulled from federal reg. It was just mentioned to me by a couple practitioners as far as people that help candidates and whatnot, as just it's really a pro-legislator, pro-candidate type provision that allows you to not have to have two fundraisers, or if you know somebody's going to max out to you in the primary and the general, that you can go ahead and take the contribution at the same time. Currently, there's nothing that prevents someone who loses a primary from accepting a general election donation. Because then that would apply to the next you're still a candidate, you lost, you're not going to be on the ballot, but there are these periods in time in which you have a campaign limit. And it's the primary election for one election, and it's a general election. Then that starts over after the election. And so the idea here is just that it saves you time, it saves the donor time, and the transparency reporting mechanism is just ultimately you show it in your accounting, or the Governmental Ethics Commission can update the forms to make sure that you can report how much that you've kept on hand for the general. So as long as that total number in your account does not exceed the amount, or the general election donations that you report that you're keeping aside do not exceed the amount in your account at the end of the primary, you're good. So it's a pretty easy accounting mechanism to see if you're compliant. If you don't want to do it, it's fine. It's how the feds do it. But ultimately, it's more of it helps you guys out in terms of, I don't have to go back to the same donor and ask for another $1,000 check or $2,000 check. Happy to talk about that a little bit more. As I said in my testimony last week, and I updated my testimony this week, and I updated the heading for the section that talks about the 2 ways to do this. It's 2 ways to skin the cat, or 2 ways to skin the cap. And that's ultimately, you've got party committees currently that are capped on the front end, but then can coordinate and give unlimited amounts to candidates on the back end. They're special. PACs aren't treated like that. No other donors are treated like that. We're all, as individual donors, capped in what we can give candidates. But parties, I think everyone would agree, exist to get their party's candidates elected. And so they have this special treatment under the law that they can coordinate currently in a general election, and they can give unlimited amounts of money to a candidate. If you're going to undo the caps to allow parties to speak more as a party, similar to a PAC can do currently, you want to recognize that on the back end, we don't want to just create this loophole that you can funnel $1 million donation one day to the party and $1 million donation from the party to the candidate the next day. And so that's what House Bill 2054 did, was it closed that loophole on the amendment by saying we're now going to cap how much parties can monetarily give to candidates at the same amount as everybody else. You don't have to do it that way. The other way to do it is to keep the current law approach, which is we're going to throttle party committees at the beginning. Currently, it's $15,000 for a state party, $5,000 for a county party. And then once you get this limited pool of money, you can use that limited pool of money however you want in a general. I would suggest if you do switch gears from what the House did and what Senate Bill 177 as written did, you at least up the caps on party committees, similar to what you're doing with candidate contributions here. You've got to kind of adjust for inflation to keep up with that, so you're not unnecessarily limiting free speech. And the other thing I would suggest that you keep in mind as you assemble a bill of what the Senate position ultimately is you've got the inflation adjustment that was in Senate Bill 177 that's not in HB 2054. You guys should decide whether you want that or not. I generally think it's a good idea so that we don't get behind like we're currently behind 30 years of not raising it since 1990. Because I think you can get behind the constitutional standards. And then second is that local government qualifier, that if you have a local government race with a population in the district of 50,000 or more, that those limits are higher. So like a Johnson County DA versus me as Jefferson County DA. So with that, I think I've kind of mapped the territory, and I'll stand for questions.
Thank you. Josh, and this may be a question for you or for the reviser. Do you know when the original caps were put into place?
1990, and they actually lowered them. So they were higher in 1990, and for whatever reason, they lowered them, and they haven't been changed. Okay. And there is, I mentioned last week during my testimony, there is a legislative research memo, I think that research presented in the House committee regarding the Alaska experience of contribution limits being too low going all the way up to the Supreme Court of the United States. So that's kind of, you got to catch up. Because when you do put limits on, you're limiting speech, and that's a fundamental right.
Gotcha. Senator Gossage.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think whatever we do, Josh, I think we all agree it needs to be increased, of course. But I just think we need to make sure that it's abundantly clear. I can just say when I was a new candidate, you're just like, oh my word, what are all these rules? It's like, well, make sure you do this, and if you do that, they need to sign this, and they need to tell you their occupation, and, all of these rules that we have, which are fine, but I just think that they need to be like extremely clear so that people know. And the differences between the two, so let's say that a committee member voted for both this bill, the other bill, because you want to see that this be increased. But then they'll work that out in conference committee. Am I right about that?
Yeah, I think, again, I want to make sure that you use your time as a committee to really understand the two options you have on parties and how PACs play into that and how candidates play into that. Because at the end of the day, the only legitimate state interest that you have, that the government has in setting these restrictions on free speech is to prevent quid pro quo and governmental corruption type activities. And so the farther away you get from the candidate, the less the government really is engaging in quid pro quo regulation, and they're just saying, we don't like X person speaking. Well, that's what you can't do. And so I think you need to kind of settle on, it took me a while to really even understand how this all works. And then the question is, well, why did our predecessors in the legislature, your predecessors in the legislature, pick this way of doing it? And ask that question now. So yeah, I think it needs to be assembled in conference committee, but the big question, other than these kind of little things that you're adjusting, big question is party committees, if they have special treatment, how do you account for that when you limit what they can do in other ways?
Further questions? Senator Dietrich.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. So I'm going to go back to a question that I asked when we were hearing this bill from the Senate side, and that was the Ethics Commission. They're the ones who audit our campaign finance reports. So, and we haven't had any weigh-in from them. And I know they're without an executive director. I don't know what's happened to the deputy director. But I'm kind of concerned just the management of it from their perspective. I mean, it will be, for those of us who have treasurers, but we do a lot of the work ourselves, it may be a little bit of an accounting nightmare, but one that I'm sure I can get past. I am willing to try. But I am worried about ethics, being able to do what they need to do to manage well, they audit reports too.
Yeah.
I just has there been any, I'm going to ask you this, has there been any conversation with them?
Yeah, I actually attend each meeting that they have, and I've had a good working relationship with Caitlin Bull-Stewart. She was just here in the local government, testified on some stuff there. And last Thursday, they did talk about the two bills that were just heard in local government, and they did weigh in on HB 2054 through that process. And I think the commission has been shifted gears in the past 6 months or so, maybe a year, to saying we don't necessarily want to weigh in on what you should do. We just want to tell you what the implications are. If I recall correctly, and I'll have to go back and watch the House testimony, there was discussion there as far as just the accounting. Nothing is requiring you to accept a general election check during a primary cycle. To me, the accounting makes sense because you just have to show you have enough cash on hand. It's kind of like a bank accounting to say that I've got enough deposits to cover what not being over leveraged or whatever. If your ending balance is not less than what you're reporting on the new forms that I think it was contemplated in the House, that the commission would update their forms to say, if you accepted general election contributions, put that amount here. And then if that is higher, let me think about this. If the amount in your account is higher or equal to the amount that you reported that you accepted on the general, then you're fine. And it happens at the federal level. So that's where we got it.
Okay, that's good to know. So there'd probably just be some
form
block
update
on the form where we have to report that.
Correct. And if you choose not to take the risk,
When would you
put
ever
0.
turn down a check?
Yeah,
If
exactly.
you ever run for office, you don't turn down checks.
Yeah, well, I'm on my 3rd term as county attorney, and
I bet you accept checks.
And so I was thinking, like, you're welcome by writing this in, but if you don't like it, it's fine.
I get it, no. Thank you, thanks.
Senator Pasquino.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. So, good to see you again, Josh. So, okay, so it sounds like we're putting all the burden on the candidate and the treasurer. So, but the lobbyists and those giving the checks, writing the checks, they have some rules too. They already know how much they can give or not give, and so they'll give a portion. They'll give $500, and then they'll send me another $500 check. So, what responsibility do they have? And so you're saying, that's one question. Second question, so the main goal is to just require the parties to limit the amount they give their party candidate? Is that?
Yeah, so those are two
Yeah.
separate things. The first is, do the lobbyists have to report on their own end what they give to candidates?
They do.
Yeah, so they obviously have to report what they spend on you, on a lobbyist, but in terms of a lobbyist giving a check to a candidate campaign, they're just like any other donor. And as a county attorney, I've never taken a check from a lobbyist just because lobbyists aren't interested in that. But you guys, have people that are interested.
Madam Chair,
Yeah.
Vice Chair, so, no, John, so the lobbyists, they're giving a contribution on behalf of their client.
Sure.
And so, but that's still reported. And so, this question about, taking a general check
Yeah.
in a primary, that already works somewhat to me because they can give me $1,000, that election cycle. However, they'll send $500 on behalf of that client for the primary, and then they'll send me $500 for the general. So I guess I'm still trying to figure out what part you're trying to fix in that area,
So as a
if we're already
campaign
doing that.
finance practitioner, I don't make a distinction between a lobbyist donor and just a neighbor donor. They're all donors, and they all are subject to $500 in the primary currently for a House and $500 for the Senate. And so if you have a fundraiser and you have a bunch of people there, you may have a lobbyist, you may not have a lobbyist there, they're all donors. And so currently they have to write a $500 check and then wait till August 5th or whenever it is and write another one. And so what this bill would do is say you can take both checks on January 20th, but you have to not spend the $500 until August 6th.
Other questions?
Was that not the, okay.
Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. So I understood what you were saying when, under an accounting method, you have to have cash on hand equal or in excess. But that's just the rule under number 2. The rule under number 1 says you have to designate separate accounts for each election or establish separate books and records. So with that, I think this could be more of an issue for the Ethics Committee, because you're all now reviewing 2 sets of books. Is that
Well,
not?
that's the
Am I
case
not
currently.
reading that?
Well, I'm just saying that's the case currently. The Ethics Commission trusts that what you put on the form reflects your bank account. And they don't send a subpoena every time for your bank account to make sure that what you put on the form is correct, because it's a crime to put something wrong on your form. And so what this would do is it's giving you 2 options to maintain good accounting records. The first is to say, just set up a separate bank account for general and then don't touch it. Most people are not going to do that, but you can, and frankly, that may be a better way to do it. But for people with modern accounting mechanisms where you set up different funds within the same account, it's the same thing with the state. The state has one big account, and then they've set up accounting funds within that to say Department of Revenue, Department of, et cetera, then you can have accounting records that show, here's what's in my general. And it's just giving you the option. You don't have to do it. You can take 2 checks if you want.
I thought you were saying that you could just show that you had more cash in excess.
That's the second option. So you can either set up 2 or have the accounting method.
I'm not reading the bill that way, and we can ask our revisor, because the bill says, if a candidate receives contribution, here are acceptable accounting methods. And then number 2 says, under any acceptable method, you have to demonstrate. So it's not either or in terms of keeping the books, and maybe we can ask the revisor to weigh in on that.
Jason?
Madam Chair, members of the committee, the acceptable methods are under paragraph 1A or B. 2 is a requirement for either acceptable accounting method that is chosen.
Thank you, I appreciate that. And so I think the other comment I'll make is that, right now, we haven't established a good way or any requirements really for candidates to have a time frame at which they have to disperse any extra monies from their account. So you can keep your account open for years. I think they've also discussed that in local government.
Yeah, I think you've had amendments on the floor before. I mean, that's.
But that's my other hesitation about doing this, because we don't, as you're trying to say in this bill, you should do it at one end or the other. And I'm sort of saying, if we allow people to accept contributions to their general campaign and don't ever say when they have to give them back, it seems like we're leaving that open. So my other question for you is, I know that we don't want parties to give candidates money during a primary. But when this is page 2, lines 38 through 43, when they say, for the purposes of this section, only the payment or other transfer of monies by a party committee shall constitute a contribution. So does that open up the opportunity for a party to be sending mail on behalf of a candidate during a primary?
Yes, under as currently amended, 2054 would allow party spending and contributions up to the limits, but unlimited party spending in both the general and the primary. So if you don't want that, you have to change the current language. That's what the House did.
Okay, but it's currently parties can't
Correct.
make expenditures, and this would open that up.
That's correct.
It's a huge change to elections.
Senator.
Point of order, Madam Chair, that Senate Bill 40 is the dispersal of accounts and being considered in local government. Just so everybody knows, Senate Bill 40, 40. Okay.
Further questions?
And frankly, that Senate Bill 40 policy, I mean, I haven't testified on it, but I think a lot of people recognize that this is something that is maybe of concern. And so that may be appropriate to amend into this bill as a concern if you're going to raise money, especially if you lose a primary. Because nothing would stop someone from accepting after they lose a primary. Whether a donor would want to give if they lost is a different question. So that is an interesting observation that you pointed out, which is if I get the donor to give before the primary and then I lose, well, I've got their money, what am I going to do with that?
Further questions? Seeing none, thank you, Josh. We will close proponent testimony. Opponent is written only. Notice on your agenda and in the S drive, all of the testimony for written only. Anybody here to testify as an opponent? Seeing none, we will close the hearing on House Bill 2054 Tomorrow, committee, we have a confirmation hearing. You guys all have your packets in your office that were delivered, so please bring those with you. And then we also are having a hearing on House Bill 2206. So with that, we are adjourned.